Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into a really complex and fascinating set of sources. We're looking at the very fabric of education systems globally.
Right, how they're structured, how they're funded.
And I think most critically, who they actually end up serving. It's a high-level analysis, very vocabulary rich. And our mission here is to, break down these big arguments and really get to the heart of this ongoing battle for what we call equality of opportunity. But before we jump right in, we do have a small request. If you could please take just a moment to subscribe and maybe turn on that notification bell, it really does make a huge difference for us. And of course, liking this deep dive and leaving a comment helps support the channel in a big way. Your engagement truly helps, so thank you.
So to get started, I think we have to frame this whole discussion around a kind of constant tension. On one hand, you have this necessary push for high academic standards. But on the other, you have this ethical need for universal access. And the sources really force us to ask a tough question.
Right.
Is elitism, favoring a small, privileged group, is that just an accidental side effect? Or is it actually inherent in the system's design from the very beginning?
That's the perfect starting point. Because the sources are clear that the number one metric for judging any education system is equality of opportunity. The ideal, of course, is that everyone has the same shot at achievement, no matter their background.
But that ideal immediately runs up against a major structural choice. We're talking about the split between selective schooling and comprehensive schooling.
Okay, let's define those. Selective is pretty much what it sounds like.
Exactly. In a selective system, pupils are chosen. It's usually for academic reasons, so through entrance exams. But sometimes, let's be honest, it's just about whether parents can afford to pay the school fees.
And comprehensive is the opposite model.
Right. It's based on inclusion, everyone gets in without exams, and the education is free because it's paid for by the government.
So with selective systems, the obvious criticism is that they're elitist by nature. They seem to just funnel the best resources to a group that's already been pre-selected.
And that group often comes from more privileged backgrounds.
But what's the argument for them? Why do these systems still exist? What's the rationale?
It's really an efficiency argument. It's often about maximizing a country's human capital. The thinking is, if you group all the most promising students together, you can give them specialized resources to really maximize their potential.
So the goal isn't equal inputs for everyone. It's about getting the most exceptional outputs from a few.
Precisely. The counter-argument is that trying to lift all students at the exact same pace might actually lower the ceiling for the highest achievers. It's seen as a trade-off.
A trade-off between broad equity and top-tier excellence.
Yes, and that structural choice, whether it's an exam at age 11 or just which zip code your family can afford to live in, it creates these massive inequalities very early on.
So the system is already making these huge decisions about a child's future before they're even a teenager.
Exactly. And that early division just perfectly sets the stage for the next layer of complexity, which is how we measure and broadcast school performance.
And that's where league tables come in.
That's right.
These are basically rankings, lists of schools from best to worst based on exam results and other things. And governments usually sell them as a tool for transparency, for driving up standards through competition.
And maybe that's the intention. Politically, they signal accountability. But the sources are very clear on the real-world consequence. What they actually do is create this public perception of a two-tier system.
And that perception is everything, isn't it?
It changes everything.
It's like the league tables are saying, this school is the high-speed express train, and that one is the slow local service. It makes it official that some schools are just seen as fundamentally better.
And that perception is immediately exploited by economic power. The sources are so clear on this. This system empowers better-off parents.
How so?
They use their money to move into the right school districts, sure, but also to pay for tutors, for extra resources. They're essentially buying a competitive edge for their kids.
So the league tables aren't just measuring a student's ability. They're measuring ability plus all that inherited advantage.
Exactly. And then you have the well-endowed schools, ones that get all the big grants and private donations.
They can afford better facilities, better teachers.
Which helps them stay at the top of the league tables. It becomes this powerful, self-reinforcing loop. And all this pressure to get to the top, while it might push some kids to excel, it also, in the long term, ends up depressing the opportunity for the less well-off kids who don't have that huge support system at home.
Okay, so the system's structure and its metrics seem to just make the existing wealth gap worse. When governments see this happening, their next move is often financial aid. especially at the tertiary education level, so university.
Yes, financial aid is the attempt to sort of break the link between a family's income and a student's opportunity. And the sources talk about three main tools for helping less privileged youngsters.
The first one being scholarships.
Right, which are usually merit-based. You get money because you have great grades or some other achievement.
And then you have bursaries, which I think are more directly about promoting equity.
They are. Bursaries are given out based on financial need to help with tuition or just the cost of living. They tackle the money problem head on. But, neither of those is usually enough to cover everything.
Which brings us to the big one, student loans.
The dominant model globally.
Right. An undergraduate, a student doing their first degree, can borrow money for their tuition fees and living costs. And the idea is they only pay it back once they're working and earning over a certain amount. It sounds like a pretty good system on paper.
It's definitely a system for access. It opens the door. But the question is it a system for equality?
And there's the friction point.
Because the loan system basically shifts the massive cost of education from the state onto the shoulders of the individual student.
And is it really equal opportunity if one student graduates debt-free because their family could pay, while another starts their career with a massive liability?
Exactly. That debt impacts every choice they make, what job they can take, where they can afford to live.
It creates a different kind of barrier.
It does, and the sources offer a pretty sobering conclusion on this. Despite all these different types of aid, very few people would argue we've achieved real equality of opportunity. The financial barrier just changes shape. It goes from an upfront cost to a lifetime of debt. So participation goes up, but true equality doesn't necessarily follow.
It really does feel like we're just applying bandages to these deep systemic economic problems. Let's shift away from finance for a moment and look at what's actually being taught. Let's talk about curriculum.
Of course, the debate that never goes away is the one about core skills. You always hear this call for a return to the 3 R's.
Reading, writing, and arithmetic.
It sounds a bit old-fashioned, but the idea behind it is crucial. These are skills nobody can do without.
We're talking about basic literacy and numeracy.
Yes, the absolute non-negotiable building blocks. If a student leaves school without those, no amount of financial aid for universities is going to fix that problem.
But assuming a student has those basics, the next fight is over the rest of the curriculum.
Oh, absolutely. The politics of curriculum reform. The sources point out a huge frustration for educators that changes to the national syllabus are often made for political reasons, not educational ones.
Can you give an example of what that looks like?
Well, it could be a new government wanting to emphasize a certain version of national history, for instance, or rushing in a new science curriculum to look tough on international test scores. It creates this constant churn and instability for teachers and students.
It's not about learning, it's about politics.
A lot of the time, yes. And at the same time, the definition of a student is changing.
You mean it's not just for kids anymore?
Exactly. The idea of lifelong or continuing education is becoming more and more important. We need flexible ways for mature students, adults, to come back and get new skills for a changing job market.
And there's another area that's incredibly resource-intensive, special needs education.
It's a huge financial commitment, but it's also a real test of a system's values.
Because it's expensive. You need smaller classes, highly trained staff.
And often, one-to-one instruction, which is one teacher for one single pupil. When budgets get tight, these are the programs that are often under threat.
And on top of all that, you have the internal school environment. The sources mention the serious impact of bullying.
Yes, because if a child is miserable or feels threatened at school, their ability to learn is just completely undermined. It doesn't matter how good the teacher is. The psychological climate is fundamental.
And who is supposed to be managing all of this? The school leadership.
And that's the final point.
Well,
head teachers and the sources complain that they spend so much of their time just getting to grips with constant new government guidelines.
More bureaucracy?
Endless bureaucracy.
Okay.
And it's a huge distraction from their real job, which should be focusing on teaching and learning inside the school.
So this deep dive has really walked us through the whole machine of educational inequality. The key takeaways seem pretty stark. Selective systems tend to create elitism. League tables just help the wealthy play that system better. And even financial aid schemes can end up just swapping an upfront barrier for a lifetime of debt. The disparity remains.
It does. And if you put all these pieces together, you're left with a final and maybe a pretty uncomfortable question. Since access to real educational advantage always seems to be defined by this line between the better off and the less well off,
Hmm.
how much does the success of an entire education system really depend on its teaching methods or its curriculum? Or is it almost completely dependent on the basic economic structure of the society it's built in? And that, I think, is the real challenge that lies far beyond the classroom walls.
Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, like, and leave a comment to support the channel.